But put that to the side. My guest is here, so I want to go to my guest. We are joined with the man himself, Jason Smith. How you doing, Jason? You doing okay this evening for us?
I'm all the better for you having me on your show, sir.
Oh, thank you, man. I appreciate that. I appreciate that. Jason Smith, he's a journalist, author, radio show host, podcaster, media commentator. His latest book is entitled A World Without Poverty, China's Roadmap to a Shared Future. Um, Jason, you blew my mind in that last show, and apparently you blew a lot of people's minds because I could read the comments of the videos. I am one of those rare YouTubers who read the comments, some of which I discard, other of which I take to heart. And in your case, there were people who were just flabbergasted. They're flabbergasted. Just at a comparison, a comparative difference in the way the societies effectively operate and the things and the cost of those various societies. And it's just, some of that stuff is just mind blowing. So thank you again for joining me, man. I really appreciate it.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. It's not me that's mind blowing. It's China. I just happen to be observing.
Fair enough. Fair enough. The watcher. Something happened recently that is also rather mind blowing. The United States tried to, when Donald Trump decided he wanted to have the sanction war, believed that it was in a position of authority, and in that position of authority could apply pressure to China. We're going to have tariffs that are 250% or some weird number. We're going to try to destroy China's ability to make high technology, in which case Joe Biden comes out with the CHIP Act and Joe Biden puts restraints on chips and everything else. Come to find out, the US is not the one that knocks on this issue. China is the one that knocks. And as evidence of that, they put out, we're not going to call it sanctions, we're going to call it limits. Let's call it limits on not just chips, or not just rare earth minerals. So, but also things like graphite, lithium, etc. I did not know this, but China apparently has like 90% of graphite market, 2/3 of the lithium market, 90% of the rare earth mineral market, including the refining capabilities of that. That part I did know. But they've extended it to not just the minerals themselves, but to processes of those minerals, which fundamentally creates a choke point. This came out, I believe this was either yesterday or day before yesterday. And Warwick Powell, a guest of the show, also gave a damn good article on this. And I'm going to have work on to kind of break down the numbers or the metrics for it. But right here, China will review on a case-by-case basis rare earth element or export applications for advanced chips and military AI development. And it points out China bans export of technologies related to assembly, commissioning, maintenance, repair, upgrading of production lines for rare earth minerals, refining metals, smelting, magnetic, manufacturing, and recycling. So this is not just, hey, we're putting, let's say, limits on rare earths. We're putting limits on even processes of those rare earths. That's pretty amazing. What brought this on? Because this seemed to be out of the blue.
I think that's the way the American media wants to portray it. If they don't understand why, then that just gives me less faith in the American media. But there's a lot of intelligent people there who are China watchers. So I'm assuming that most people in the US government, most people in the US media actually know that this wasn't out of the blue, as I think you suspect. The reality is this is tit for tat. The United States went after China with semiconductors. The former Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo, referred to her own work in attempting to cut off semiconductors from China as, quote, a fool's errand. Those were her words as she exited the cabinet position that she held when she was the one responsible for trying to cut off semiconductors to China. And there are several amusing anecdotal stories about that. When she came to China for her first official visit as a cabinet minister, one of the Huawei phones was released that had a very advanced semiconductor chip that the United States didn't think China had the ability to manufacture that fast, but in fact it had. And a lot of people joking, not the official company, but a lot of people made banners of her face and said, Gina Raimondo uses Huawei phones and so forth, sort of poke at her. But I think she realized that Biden had sent her on this ridiculous mission that was impossible because China had the ability to catch up in semiconductors in a few years. A lot of people in the United States said it would take 10 years, but China in some ways is already caught up because they're able to stack semiconductors in a certain kind of way and get similar levels of efficiency. And in some ways, China is getting ready to leapfrog silicon technology to other kinds of technologies, to even faster semiconductors than are currently manufactured. The West still holds, the record for speed in semiconductors and manufacturing really small semiconductors at scale. But most of those are actually not practical. They wouldn't put them in your phone anyway. And they wouldn't put them in a missile either, because a missile needs actually a much larger kind of semiconductor, which China actually is the leader in manufacturing in the world. But China does, and it's not just rare earth minerals. They're all over the world. And the United States has a lot of them actually at home. And there are countries around the world with enormous supplies of rare earth minerals. It is the manufacturing and the processing, which sometimes can go through 100 different chemical permutations before they get to the final product, in order to separate them out from everything else that they're mixed in with when they come out of the earth. China began developing this capability in the early 1980s, and it took that long from then to now to build the largest supply chain and technology in the world. There are 36 universities in China that offer majors in the processing of rare earth minerals, whereas there are 0 in the United States. So it's not just the rare earth minerals and it's not just the processing, but it's all of this technology that China has innovated, and China controls this technology. So if the United States wants to play, oh, we're going to tariff you to death, China is just saying, this is what we will do back. And so China is really doing tit for tat. There's a really good example that points out exactly China's tit for tat, and it just happened because about 2 months ago, the United States attempted to impose fees for vessels that were owned by Chinese companies going to U.S. ports. So I think it was today or yesterday, China also said, we're going to impose fees for vessels and companies coming to Chinese ports. So all China is doing is just holding a mirror up to the United States and saying, this is what you're doing, but we can do it better. And, China, like you said,
Come back. He'll be back. There you are. Okay, good. You froze for a little bit, or this may be a perspective thing. I don't know if it was I froze or you froze, but it's perfectly okay. Yeah, it's like I'm the one who knocks, right? It's just one of those things. Warwick points out in his article, he says, the new Chinese restrictions announced on October 9th, 2025 extend beyond commodities to include the technological processes required to make them useful. This is a deft and also an important expansion of reach from resource control to technological choke point management, effectively saying, look, this is going to create a choke point. And all of these policies that either the Trump administration wanted to do with AI, the Biden administration wanted to do, all of that's gone. You're spending $1 trillion on your military, or I think it was 900 billion or whatever that number is. Okay, how do you get the planes? How do you build the jets? How do you build missiles? Hell, how do you build the EVs? How do you build just basic electronics when all of these things are now going to go through a Chinese choke point where they're being decided upon on a case-by-case basis? And it was something else that Warwick pointed out. He says, if it wasn't for AI, the U.S. economy would have only grown by 0.1%. So we were effectively living off of the technology that China has now put a choke point on as we move forward into time. That's amazing. That is amazing. No, obviously this didn't come out the blue. But I sense that there's something else going on also, though. Like, meaning not just the tariffs, but China is putting this under the notion of national security and making the argument that, well, we also want to stop the proliferation of weapons across the globe. Is there more to it than that?
Well, a lot of people are making that argument. A lot of people, the Chinese government hasn't really officially made the argument that they're trying to reduce U.S. stockpiles of weapons or stop what's happening in Gaza, but that's implied in a lot of the work that they're doing. I did want to point out something really fast
Oh,
about Warwick Powell. I'm a friend of his.
yeah.
And he's one of the things he wrote in his article that you're referring to is the U.S. can keep its dollars. China has the dysprosium. I don't know what that is, but it's a rare earth mineral. And I think it's
I love
really
the way
funny.
he puts the stuff right. Yeah, dysprosium.
Because the U.S. is selling U.S. dollars in order to buy gold and has been doing that since around 2013. So the U.S. keeps weaponizing the dollar, using its sanctions, hurting countries around the world. It's Europe and the United States are stealing Russian money. So a lot of that is actually really interesting because that is scaring away huge investors like China, which in 2008 bought $1 trillion in U.S. treasuries. But when the
Yes.
United States turned to China and said, you know what, we're gonna try to contain you. And basically that came out of several administrations. And it's not either party. It seems to be both parties. And so China's like, okay, well, we'll slowly reduce our holdings of U.S. treasuries until now. China holds more gold than it does U.S. treasuries, which is a reverse from just last year. So, I mean, that is something that these are self-inflicted wounds. The way that the United States is attempting to deal with China is aggressive. They're framing China as an adversary when in my personal opinion, the United States, its best interest is to frame China as a peer. One of the things that was happening to the UK when it began to lose its hold on global power is it turned to the obvious successor and said, okay, US, we're going to be allies with you because, we want to basically stay relevant. I think if the United States wants to stay relevant in the emerging multipolar world, its best hope is to develop a closer diplomatic relationship, closer trade ties with China. And I think that Washington, D.C., for the last 4 administrations, has really fumbled that and messed up. So I think China's not just attempting to stop U.S. proliferation, but it's saying that it can. That is essentially a threat to one of the things that the United States values, and that it's its military primacy, which a lot of the rest of the world isn't very fond of. So if the United States wants to come back to the table and lower tariffs and go tit for tat back down to where it was before maybe 2016, it can do that. But one of the things that I think this Trump administration, the new one, is they really came out arrogantly and thought that they could really knock China down. You say if China is the one that knocks. China isn't trying to hurt the United States. China is trying to show the United States that it is capable of doing so that in future negotiations, the United States might come to its senses. Now, there is a rumor, and this rumor was started by the Wall Street Journal, that China has in fact offered the United States $1 trillion of investments in factories and other things to help the U.S. economy in exchange for basically, peace. And it has a list of kind of demands that it would like. And if the United States, if Trump wants to win, I swear this is the only way to go, is to basically take China up on its offer and put the China hawking to the side. I really think that is the best way to go for the United States.
Oh, that's hard. That's hard. Because what you're asking is a country that views itself as a hegemon. Still, I don't believe for a moment the U.S. has given up on this idea of a hegemon. That has spent the last, as you point out, like 3 or 4 administrations with the entire objective to be, we need to contain China. China is an issue. China is a threat. They pulled 800 billion people out of poverty, 800 million people out of poverty. This is an issue for us. We got to do something about it. Meaning Obama's entire policy for the whole Trans-Pacific Partnership was to cow China. And so it's like you have this momentum, not to mention this hubris that runs through this kind of thread of U.S. thinking. That is a hard ship to turn around. But to your point, 78% of U.S. I'm sorry, just one last point. 78% of U.S. military hardware requires components from China. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. 78. How do I put this? 78%. There it is. Over 78% of military systems rely on materials sourced directly from China or indirectly from China. Maybe they should put it to the side. Give me your thoughts.
I completely agree. I think the United States' only choice, well, I mean, I actually would like to see the U.S. de-escalation of its military, of our military. I think it's overkill, and we can look at around U.S. infrastructure. We clearly need to be investing in the republic, not in the empire. But that's
Agreed.
beside the point. If the United States wants to continue to be a viable economy, the only way forward is with Chinese companies. There's a Chinese company, it's just one example of many. There's a professor at Princeton, Kyle Chan, who tracks all of the Chinese JVs, joint ventures in the United States. But this is just one example of those. It's called Invenergy, and it's opened with a Chinese solar company and an American solar company, and it manufactures solar for the U.S. market and export with American workers on American soil, but it uses Chinese technology. That is the kind of win-win that the United States needs. The United States if we want to bring manufacturing back, firstly, it's very difficult because of the input problem and the cost of all of these, the cost of electricity, the cost of energy, water, all of these things. But if we do want to start bringing manufacturing back, we need Chinese technology. The CEO of Ford went to the BYD factory in China, and he said it was, quote, humbling. I mean, he said a lot of other things that basically go towards that. But if Ford or GM want to be successful, they should be doing JVs with BYD and China's Chery and working with Chinese companies using Chinese innovation, Chinese technology, and bringing that to U.S. consumers. Because, for example, BYD has a car that in US dollars costs $12,000. Could you imagine the glee of American consumers if they had a state-of-the-art EV that only costs $12,000? This is what is being denied us.
Yeah, I remember that. I saw the interview with that Ford guy, and he made the point of saying, which I think is somewhat kind of ludicrous, but maybe not. I understand where he was trying to get at, that the lack of competition has hampered the American market, that this being able to compete would have made better cars and forced them to be able to make better cars. But I think what he kind of misses, and I want your take on it, is maybe he can't compete. Like maybe the US looked at it and thought to themselves, there's no way these American automakers can compete with the products that are coming out of China. And so it would decimate our own domestic market. And so even though we may not be able to sell those cars abroad, at the very least, we can maintain our market and sell them here. Give me your thoughts on that, though. I mean, because I heard his comments and I was like, dude, I think they're trying to save you. You're missing it.
Well, I mean, honestly, the United States cannot compete in a lot of fields with China. And I think that a degree of protectionism is actually a good idea. And I think China actually taught this lesson, because as the IMF and World Bank were going around the world, insisting that poor countries opened up their markets to Western investments and forced them to liberalize their economies and sell off their national assets, China said, whoa, whoa, whoa. We're not going to do that. We'll take your loans and we'll pay them back, but we're not liberalizing our economy to the degree to which all these other countries did. And they have, in fact, protected certain industries. So I think when the United States is looking, down the line, it's not always a great idea to just open the floodgates for everything that's going to come in. And I think the United States should be taking cues from China. We talked about SOEs. I would love to see more utilities in the United States. But going back to rare earth minerals and the United States military, clearly you're making an excellent point. And I think this is a point that's missed by a lot of people, because I see a lot of people with huge accounts, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of followers on various social media saying, oh, we'll just make our own rare earth minerals. An economist, I can't remember his name, last week suggested, an American economist, that it would take 29 years to catch up with where China is now if we went all in and we started, investing in education and started subsidizing, and the military was part of that, and we just went completely berserk trying to catch up. But the United States is going to need more munitions next year. We don't have 29 years, which I think that means the U.S. is going to be forced to the table, and there's going to be some kind of deal. As an American who lives in China, I hope it's $1 trillion investment from China in the United States, because that would mean continued peace, and I could safely enjoy my time without being concerned about the United States, concerned about what I'm doing over here. I would much rather that China and the U.S. had a peaceful relationship. And, the Chinese people and the U.S. people were very similar. I mean, put aside all the politics and stuff, we're just people. We just want everyone somewhere in China right now, there's a grandfather holding his grandson's hand and they're walking home from school. And I'm sure the same thing is going to happen a million times in the United States tomorrow as well. Like, we're really just people, and we need our governments to get along. There are things that the United States needs that China has. There are things that China needs that the United States has. And, Chinese people really love the United States. They love Marvel movies. They love, Dune, Dune 2. Dune 2 was huge here. I
Yeah.
mean, it's not like people in China hate the United States, but there does seem to be a few very critical people in the U.S. government who hate China, and I think that that's not healthy for the United States. A much healthier play for the United States moving forward is cooperation with China and integration economically and diplomatically.